Welcome into this week's episode of Your Drone Questions Answered, brought to you by Drone Launch Academy. I'm your host, Chris Breedlove, as always. Today, we got more of a not breaking news, but more of a current events and a newsy-based episode tackling the recent executive orders released just last Friday on June 6th, two different ones. So let me tackle this question. I'm excited to welcome back the founder and owner of Drone Launch Academy, David Young. David, thanks so much for joining the show.
What's up, Chris?
Two executive orders were just announced on Friday, June 6th. And we're going to break them down kind of in order. I think the first one, there maybe is some interesting stuff, maybe less relevant to probably the average drone operator. And then we'll get into the second one, unleashing American drone dominance. But first, David, let's just talk a little bit about restoring American airspace sovereignty. That's the first one we're going to tackle on this show. And by the way, for our listeners, both of these links will be in the show notes just for easy access. But David, what are your initial reactions, highlights, takeaways to restoring American airspace sovereignty?
Yeah, I think overall, nothing that's like earth shattering for, I guess, your, everyday Part 107 operator or even company that's got a drone program, right? They're just essentially ratcheting up the control over critical infrastructure, I guess was the biggest takeaway for me, right? So if you think about the rules were always written for just general aviation, civil aviation. So you got aircraft, which are always operating fairly high. They'll do a TFR usually for an area and it's got some type of ceiling on it. Or there's certain places that have TFR set up with some ceiling and they'll let air traffic pass overhead. But as soon as you got drones and everybody can operate at 80 feet above ground level, maybe they want people cruising around nuclear facilities. And the way the rules were written, it's like, hey, as long as you're not standing in an area you're not allowed to like take off or land from or operate from, you can kind of go wherever, right? That's always been the thing when people talk about national parks. It's like, well, I can't operate from within a national park, but I can get outside and fly in, right? Kind of these
Mhm.
workarounds, which in my opinion is fine, but I can definitely see how it causes problems when you're around prisons, military installations, nuclear facilities, things like that. So it makes sense. So if you're a real nerd and you want to dive into the executive order and go to specific sections, I was looking at section 5, right? So basically tasking the FAA with submitting a NPRM, which is notice of proposed rulemaking. So anytime the government wants to add like an executive rule, like that's how Part 107 was created, right? It was a 14 CFR, so 14 Code of Federal Regulations. Part 107 is the part that dictates the rules for drones. And so that's how they created that rule, same way they're creating other rules. Basically, this just says it's going to create a task force that's going to look at restricting drone flights over fixed site facilities and interpreting to the extent appropriate critical infrastructure consistent with some other definitions. So they're basically looking at how do we protect critical infrastructure from either people doing dumb stuff or unwanted foreign surveillance kind of. Again, I don't think most people in here are like, I really want to go out and film the nuclear facility, or I really want to go cruise my drone over the army base. I do think that one thing that may impact people is you get the next one, section 6. They said the attorney general, in conjunction with the FAA, so basically Department of Justice with the FAA, they said they're going to take more steps to ensure full enforcement of applicable civil and criminal laws when drone operators endanger the public, violate established airspace restrictions, or operate a drone in furtherance of an element of another crime. So I think one of the things people complained about, especially people who did have a license, right, was there's no crackdown on unlicensed operators or people going into you technically have to get these permission to fly in controlled airspace or other places. But a lot of times people are just either ignorant of the law or don't care, and they'll just go fly their drone around wherever. So I think this at least provides a written pathway or a written requirement to crack down on that. Although I'm sure they're going to probably focus more on the ones that are more serious crimes or more endangering the public. But hopefully this can lead to a bit more enforcement of the rules. I think those were sort of my two main takeaways.
I agree, David. It's funny too. I could see though that section 5 all comes back to, well, what is critical infrastructure? Who's defining that?
It does define critical infrastructure, but as these things normally do, it references something else. So 42 US Code 5195C, it defines it as assets, physical or virtual, that are so vital to the United States that incapacity or destruction of such systems and assets would have a debilitating impact on security, national economic security, national public health or safety, or any combination. So I feel like that's, probably not going to be too broadly applied, but
I agree. Hopefully it's not overly, heavily handed applied to every
yeah,
park and corner thing, whatever. But if it was, then hopefully the pendulum could swing back and
sure.
But section 9 is interesting too around that building counter UAS capacity. They specifically call out like the World Cup in 2026 and the 2028 Summer Olympics. So, and that makes sense to me too, right? Whether it's massive events like that, whether it's the Super Bowl, if people who flout the rules don't have any negative repercussions, others are like, well, wait a minute, I missed that opportunity. I missed that
Right.
awesome.
Yeah.
So hopefully there's a more maybe balanced playing field and not a free for all in some of those instances.
One
So
thing I thought was it just made me chuckle a little bit is with remote ID. So I don't know. Yeah, I don't have the most informed take on this, I would say, because I didn't like come up with the remote ID and I haven't like done tons of testing on the ranges and the different methods and things like that. But from the understanding I do have is remote ID can be pretty short range. Like you can technically comply with remote ID laws and have a module on there that barely like transmits like very far. You can comply with the law, but just like have nothing that's actually useful for the government. And one of the things in here was under, I think it was section 7, which was detection, tracking, and IDing drones and drone signals. It was basically telling the FAA that they have to make I believe, the remote ID, content available to other federal organizations that need it to be able to enforce a lot of that stuff. And it just kind of made me laugh a little bit. Like, I don't really think that's going to do a lot for them. But if they really want to accomplish what they're trying to do with remote ID, you probably need another system.
100%. And that's a perfect segue, David, because the second executive order is unleashing American drone dominance. Like the name, interesting name. But section 1, to that point, is how to safely integrate drones into the national airspace system, which, to your point, remote ID obviously, or on paper, is supposed to be a critical aspect of that. And yet, to your point, the technical limitations of how far is that really going? You have to stand so close to the operator. And it just,
Yeah.
might be a little pointless. But so anyway, unleash American dominance. What are your big takeaways from that executive order?
Well, the biggest one that I'm hoping sticks is the beyond visual line of sight, BVLOS order, section 4. Now, what it says is within 30 days, the FAA has to issue a proposed rule enabling routine beyond visual line of sight operations for drones for commercial and public safety purposes. And it says the final rule has to be published within 240 days. It's saying, hey, you got to have the proposed rule out for people to look at within 30 days. And then within 240 days, that's 8 months ish. It's got to be like a real rule on the books that we can use. So that's exciting if that actually works. Because if you're unfamiliar with beyond visual line of sight, that's a ton of asset inspections. Think about pipelines, power transmission lines, all these different things you can inspect. Also, drone deliveries, right? It opens up this whole world of economic opportunity for using drones. I think the downside is there was already with the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024 stuff in there that Congress said, hey, FAA, you got to get these same thing, proposed rulemaking out, and you got to make a rule on it. And they missed the deadline. Stuff never happened. Apparently, they did send a rule up, but it's got to go through these little chains, right? So it's got to go FAA to the Department of Transportation and there, the Office of Management and Budget at the White House. I'm not like a legislative expert, but it has to go through this sort of chain to be published. I don't know who or what slowed it down through there, but we still have no rule on beyond visual line of sight operations, and we were supposed to have one at this point. So at least there's something in writing that says, hey, this is a priority. You need to do this. So hopefully it speeds it up. But I guess I'm not holding my breath is what I'm saying.
Yeah, a lot of optimism, I would say. I think in much of really both of these, but especially this second executive order we're talking about, if this actually lights a fire under the appropriate entities and agencies and officials, maybe we just get to a place we're hoping and probably trending towards anyway. But do we get there in 6 or 8 months and not in 18 months? So that would be positive, certainly, if this accelerated timeline actually comes to pass.
One thing is, the B underneath that, I think helps with saying, hey, here's how we can clear up some roadblocks. So it also tells them within 30 days, you have to figure out what are the clear metrics that you're going to use to assess how safe BVLOS operations are. And then within 6 months, you have to identify and describe other regulatory barriers that are going to be a challenge to that implementation. So hopefully they stick to that and it works. I would be excited to see that if it actually happens. And I know that'll open up so many things, especially, oh yeah, just another thing comes to mind. I've just seen such an uptick trend-wise in drone docks and
Mm.
remote operations. So even people that are operating under waivers right now. So they'll get a waiver to operate drones beyond visual line of sight from a remote, if you guys are unfamiliar with docks, the drone sits there on a charger essentially and little cage opens up and the drone can pop out and fly around. You can fly it from other places or it can fly it on its own like an automated flight. But a lot of times, yeah, they have to go through all these waivers and all this process. But I think if they can get a good rule on the books, that'll open that up a lot. I can definitely see that segment of the market taking off.
Yeah. Hopefully it comes to pass, right, in positive ways.
And I think, they get so many requests, and I have heard them say, that's one of the reasons they relaxed some of the rules. I think it was like 2021, where it used to be like way more strict, even about like operating over moving vehicles and things like that. And then they got data back like, oh, not really anyone has been hurt by drones falling out of the sky. Maybe this wasn't as dangerous as we thought. I mean, I think I looked at some data for injuries related to drones and like all the OSHA documents that there were, and there's some other method of collection that they use to record different injury statistics. And like by and large, the most injuries happen from lacerations from people grabbing drones, right? Like the propeller laceration. So, you're on a boat, you're grabbing your drone or whatever you're operating. I have never heard of personally, I'm not saying it hasn't happened. I've never heard of a drone falling out of the sky and the object colliding with a person and causing them injury. Like, I feel like that would be more newsworthy in the drone world, but I've
Yeah.
never heard that happening. Again, not saying it
I've
hasn't.
heard of one. I've heard of one example to your point of, like, I think it was a drone light show actually where it kinda went haywire. Maybe it was down in
Okay,
Orlando. And also I feel like drone light shows, not to, like, speak
but
ill of that, I
like a
mean, that's a lot
thousand of
more
them.
complicated, right? That's
Yeah,
dozens or hundreds of drones, and if something goes haywire but if it's one drone that you're responsible for under Part 107,
yeah.
the odds are pretty low, I would think, in almost all situations, right?
Well,
To
with the
to
drone light show, you're gathering a lot of people together and then putting like 1,000 drones like next to them.
right
So I
over
think
them. Yeah, yeah.
you like higher risk, right? So that's like the FAA, like even for manned aircraft, they relax the rules for like sparsely populated areas, right? Like you can fly lower and things like that. Maybe they'll do something like that with, but anyways, all I'm saying is I think they, at least they have looked at the data before to be like, hey, maybe this isn't quite as high a risk as we thought. Let's relax the rules. So I think that AI thing provision is say, hey, use AI to help you analyze more data so you can relax or get rid of rules if needed, which would be great. When we
Absolutely.
jump down to the other thing that I think a lot of people will be interested in, which is the supply chain part.
Absolutely. Section 7. So the title of Section 7, again, we're still under Unleashing American Drone Dominance, the second executive order, at least second in our order and how we're talking about it. But in Section 7, as that title suggests, it's about supply chain. And I'm not going to read the whole text here, but the references to protect the integrity of the American drone supply chain, ensure our technology remains secure from undue foreign influence, etc., and to ensure the vital components remain under American control, free from national security risks, so on and so forth. And then, so what has to happen within 90 days of this order, Secretary of Commerce shall take actions, including various things, proposed rulemaking, et cetera, to secure the United States drone supply chain against foreign control. So, to me, what all that means, it sounds a little bit like window dressing, quite frankly, but it also doesn't scare me either. DJI bans or Chinese drone bans, et cetera, this really doesn't directly take that on. It certainly doesn't add anything more. It also, again, sets that policy tone of trying to lean into American components. Let's use the tools that we want to use that are best suited for whatever task we're trying to perform. And does it matter that it came from Brazil or Japan or Switzerland or whatever? I totally get. I'm not naive about it. Does matter if it comes from China or Russia, perhaps, and so on. But like, it just so happens, of course, that the Chinese make the best ones, and that whole conversation is beyond what we're trying to do here today. But I still think the reality is the gap remains so large, and I just hope that no one cuts off us as drone pilots. I'm nervous about that particular provision, but I hope it works itself out to truly elevate and increase our own domestic capacity without taking away choice. But who knows how that's really gonna play out. But what do you think?
Well, when I read this, I mean, so I guess the buzz previously was the last National Defense Authorization Act had the provision in there, which a lot of people called the DJI ban, right? Which essentially ended up being, did not outright ban DJI, but instead said, hey, we think DJI might be bad. We want somebody to take a look at it and assess whether it really does pose a national security risk. If it is determined that it does, we're going to add it to the covered list. And we've addressed this in other videos, but for those of you who may not be up to speed, essentially the way they were going to do the ban is they were going to say anytime a company wants to use spectrum or like radio frequencies in the US, they have to go through the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, and get like a license to like broadcast their signals on whatever frequency bands that is, and they get approval, and then they can sell their products in the United States and they can operate on those frequencies. They were going to ban them was just going to say, hey, we're going to put DJI or whatever these bad companies are on this. It's called a covered list, which kind of sounds like cute and not bad, but basically means they're like banned from using the frequencies. So they basically would say DJI is not allowed to get approval for any of that anymore. So unless DJI wanted to switch to the Ukrainian and Russian system of doing everything with fiber optic cables directly connected to your control station, they can't use the radio frequencies, which would have rendered their sort of products useless. So they wouldn't be able to do it. So that was like the way they were going to ban it. But now you see that it moves away necessarily from like, oh, hey, we think these companies pose a data risk, right? They're sending data back to China. And that was sort of like the talk before. And now it's more looking at like, hey, we want to secure our supply chain. So just the focus switched from data security to supply chain. I mean, maybe it's still the same underlying issue in their minds or something, but at least the wording changed. I'm a little bit fuzzy on how this is going to play out. Again, I'm not like a legislative analyst or anything, but it says within 30 days of this order, the Federal Acquisition Security Council shall publish a covered foreign entity list as defined, blah, 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 identifying companies that pose supply chain risks. How are they going to do that? What's the criteria? Or is that just a way for them to just make an excuse to throw DJI on that list? I don't know. I guess we'll see how that goes. It also says in the next part, right, within 90 days of this order, so 90 days of June 6th, Commerce will take actions, including rules, notice, or proposed rulemaking and investigations to, quote, secure the United States drone supply chain against foreign control or exploitation. I don't know exactly what that means or how that will come to fruition. We'll see. I mean, I don't think this supersedes the other NDAA rule that says, hey, we need to take a look at it. Well, the bad thing about that other rule was, and if nobody decides to take a look at it within a year, it'll just automatically, they'll be on the list. And so everybody's just going to be like, oh, well, I'm not doing it, punt. And it listed the entities that could evaluate it. And it was like the DOD, the FBI, the CIA, Homeland Security. It just listed a ton of people. It didn't actually assign responsibility to anyone. So I could just easily see that, especially in the federal government, just being like, well, we're too busy. I'm not looking at, I'm not going to do it. And then, just automatically gets done or it takes effect after a year. So I guess
Yeah.
this one's still not super clear, but we'll wait and see. But I'm interested, at least this is a shorter timeline on how quickly they have to look at certain things. So maybe we'll know more information sooner than later.
Yeah, I would have loved to see the latest NDA act, or whether it did or didn't, put a specific, and I think as DJI has said in a lot of their public communications or anyone, like, hey, put a standard, right? I do wish there was more language in this that kind of spoke to that. It is vague to your point. It doesn't seem to supersede or contradict anything. So maybe status quo is somewhat in the case, but also to your point, at least we might know something by July or August as opposed to waiting until January 1st of like, "Oh, well, that was maybe not great." But yeah, time will tell. And I guess speaking of time, to kind of wrap this up, I think the other piece we wanted to touch on was maybe Section 8 about exporting of American made, and there's some stuff you wanted to touch on there.
Well, yeah, I would just say, like, okay, DJI gets banned, or if DJI gets banned, the main question we get asked like all the time is, well, okay, if there's no DJI, what's the US alternative? Like, what's the US thing for us to use? And everybody's always so disappointed with our answer of like, there is not a like comparable alternative. Like, yeah, if you're like real enterprise and you got a lot of money, right? Like there are systems that can do things that you need done, right? For the everyday consumer in the like 700 to $3,000-$4,000 range, right? Like the nice low end, I guess you would say, there's not like a good option for that. And so at least in here, it says, hey, we want to like do everything we can to prioritize the United States capability to create UAS and related systems. So, and they want to be able to like export systems. So not only is like, we're picking where stuff comes from to make sure it's safe, but we're like, hey, we should build up our own base of being able to like create and invent this stuff and manufacture it here and export it. We'll see how that works. But with that, at least they're going to promote, they're like, hey, do everything you can to promote this. So they list direct loans and loan guarantees, equity investments and co-financing, political risk insurance and credit guarantees, technical assistance, feasibility studies, market access facilitation, and any other incentive mechanism authorized by law. Let's do everything we can to at least support United States manufacturers or people who are trying to build up the United States capabilities to do engineering and manufacturing of UAS. So at least that's helpful to hopefully build up some people where they can have some systems that can compete. Because right now everybody's like, well, I want to use DJI because there's nothing else that competes in that price range. So maybe this will get us closer. I don't know. That was my last comment on that. At least there's something in
Yeah.
here to try to boost that. If it will, how well that will work, I don't know, but at least there's something.
Yeah, and there's just encouragement to folks. If DJI still checks the right boxes for you and for what you're trying to do in your business, and I think it does for many, I personally would not be afraid to make that investment today, as long as you have a way to monetize it like in the near term. If you're just buying it kind of on spec, oh, I think I might start trying to do some stuff and drop 8 grand or whatever it is now with all the tariffs for an M4EE. Maybe that's not as good of an investment. But if you've got clients and work ready, like get the best tool that you can now and let the chips fall where they may. That's just my 2 cent
Yeah.
opinion.
Just to add on to what you're saying, I know a lot of people, yeah, they get crippled by the choice. And I've talked to some people through this where like, oh, I got this, or I need, I want to do this. I would say get something to work with. The only people I know that truly are like not allowed to use DJI products or Chinese products And I've talked to surveyors and different people who have different customers and clients. They're able to use it on most everything. But then if you're going to get like a government contract, that's usually where you can't use it. But government contracts typically pay like really well. And they're usually a really long process of like RFPs and like going through this procurement process and all that stuff. Where if you get a government contract and you're going to do that, then you should have plenty of capital to go out and get one of the expensive, US made drones. And B, once you get the contract, go get the drone you need or rent it. There's a lot of drone rental places that'll help you do it that you can get it from. I know a friend, I don't think he owns any drones. He just like, I'll just rent them every time I need them. There's into the price of the job. It's like he'll go rent an M350 with a L2 LiDAR and he'll just be like, cool, I'll use it on this job. It's whatever, $1,500 to rent the whole setup. And then just bake that into my fee. Obviously you want some experience on like using the platforms, but all that to say, don't just do nothing because you don't pick a drone to do it. Use what you got. And then if you get a contract where it's like, oh, I've got to have this other drone, well, then get the contract signed and then go buy the drone. So anyways, that's my take.
No, I think that's great. David, again, thanks so much for jumping on. Certainly, we'll continue monitoring the space as everyone does in the drone space. And some kind of big developments along these lines, maybe we see something really does happen in 30 to 60 to 90 to all these different, timelines. We'll be back on YDQA to tackle that. But until next time, as always, submit your questions on ydqa.io. Email me at chris@launchacademy.com. But until next time, have a great week.